Hello everyone, DonTheCrown here, and today we're going to be talking about the Spiritborn, and more specifically the datamined Paragon information that we have gotten thanks to the guys over at Wowhead. And pretty much we're going to go over the Paragon legendary nodes. We have the Paragon glyphs and some updated information about some of the aspects. Some of the very overpowered aspects kind of got toned down a little bit, but I still think that there are some really ridiculous combinations that we can potentially do, and there's definitely some very fun stuff. This is going to hop right into the legendary nodes, but before we do that, notice that about 80% of you guys do not subscribe to the channel that do watch the content, and one of the best ways that you can help support the channel is just by hitting that subscribe button or that thumbs up or leaving a comment down below. Let me know what you think, or just like some reaction to the content here, and does help out massively. So looking at the legendary nodes, this is going to be kind of pretty important because now they're making some changes to how Paragon boards work, and you're only going to get to add 4 boards to your starter board. And so we're going to be a total of 5 Paragon boards, which means that we're going to have a lot of points to spend stuff inside the board, which means that it's going to be very, very important that you pick boards that have legendary nodes that align with your build, because you're probably going to end up picking them up. Now, the legendary glyphs also give you a ton of damage, but we'll talk about them shortly. Starting off with the first one here is basically just a 30% damage bonus. You gain bonus damage equal to 20% of your 2 highest bonuses to damage types combined, up to 30% total. And so this is just a nice little multiplier that you get here just for picking up other damage other places. It does cap out at 30%, which is pretty standard for a legendary node. Bitter medicine is kind of interesting here because when you heal for 100% of your maximum life, you deal 30% damage to close enemies. This damage is increased by your healing received bonus, but I'm not really sure that there's a lot of ability to stack healing received, but being able to scale this 1-to-1 seems pretty strong. I know there are some uniques that do have healing received bonus, and so I do think that there's some opportunities to maybe like wear the Andariel's hat with this and just be blowing up enemies for overhealing like crazy, and hopefully this does work with overhealing. Next up, we have Vicious Shield. You do 1% increased damage for each 3% of your maximum life you have as barrier. This does seem pretty okay. It's only 33% if you're capped out your life, capped out your barrier. So that does require you to basically have a ton of shield. So this is probably something that you're going to primarily see Gorilla players using. I think Gorilla, for the most part, is not going to have a hard time capping this out. This does kind of encourage you a little bit to move away from stacking health, because you want to get more barrier up there, or to stack barrier generation on your gear or on your gems, which is kind of interesting from an itemization standpoint. Next up, we have Drive. After moving 10 meters, you deal 3% increased damage for 10 seconds. This can stack up to 10 times. So once again, this is another 30% damage multiplier, which is pretty basic. Now there is a new rune word that makes it so that when you move 5 meters, stuff kind of like starts to happen. And so if you combine the 2 of these, really kind of just encourages you to move around quite a bit to get action going on, which I think can be pretty interesting. Now, having to move all of the time while you are fighting a boss might be a pain, especially if these don't like continue to stack and you have to move like 100 meters every 10 seconds. But for the most part, I think this is going to be a very popular legendary node to take, along with Convergence, because they both seem pretty generic. They seem like they'll work with everything. Next up, we have Sapping. Sapping, I think, kind of looks a little bit strange here, because when you cast 3 Gorilla, Jaguar, Eagle, or Centipede skills with the same spirit in a row, restore 15% of your vigor and deal 30% increased damage for 5 seconds. I'm assuming that this means base spirit, because otherwise this just pops off anytime you cast 3 skills in a row. Because the way that the primary spirit hall works is it applies like if you pick Gorilla, all your skills are Gorilla. So now it's just whenever you cast 3 skills in a row, restore 15% of your vigor and deal increased damage. I think that this is a little bit too specific for 30% damage. It does also give you 15% vigor back, so there's some shenanigans there as well. If this is base spirit, it's probably gonna be a little bit hard to proc off. If it's not, then it's probably too easy and kind of like too convoluted in terms of the wording. But I think this like might need a little bit of a tweak to it. Next we have spiny skin. So at first glance, this might seem really bad. When you use a cooldown, you gain 20% thorns for 5 seconds. However, Spiritborn has an inordinate amount of scaling thanks to thorns, and like your gorilla can like, you know, hit and do 100% of your thorns damage just from the primary spirit hall. If you're doing like a thorns basic attack skill with Sepazantec, that's going to allow you to, with the gorilla basic, apply that thorns multiple times, or like another 100%. If you're using the loyalty hat, that doubles the effectiveness of your primary spirit hall, that's another 100% thorns. So having more thorns is very, very good for those types of builds. Revealing is a lucky hit chance to knock down vulnerable enemies, and you do a 30% increased damage to crowd control enemies. Now, personally, I think that this 30% is maybe too low of a number. I like that they're trying to like not have it be too much. However, against bosses, this is pretty much a non-legendary node until you stagger them. So unless you're able to stagger them pretty quickly, you're kind of losing out on damage here because they don't really become crowd controlled. Realistically, I wish that they would rework how crowd control works against bosses. But like there was a little bit like, it's not like all or nothing, which is how it is right now. And then lastly, we have Infighter. So when you dodge or block an attack, you gain 2% increased attack speed and 1% increased damage for 5 seconds, stacking up to 9 times. Now, hopefully this allows you to kind of keep it rolling. This is 18% attack speed and 9% damage. And honestly, this doesn't look all that great. One of the big problems here is this does require you to dodge or block an attack. Against single targets, there might be a lot of times where you know, the boss just doesn't swing at you. And there's also a lot of times where like if the boss is charging up a big attack, that the best way to avoid taking damage is just to not be where they're going to attack you. And having to kind of face tank stuff for damage kind of seems bad. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the different legendary nodes. I think that, what's it, 1, 2, 3, 4. We're only getting 8 boards, I think, right now. There might be one more board in the wings, or we might only be getting 8 boards. Next up, we have 22 Paragon glyphs. Now, Paragon glyphs are getting changed a little bit. We're going to go over the wording of these. So first off, you might notice that it says bonus, another bonus, and an additional bonus. So I believe that the way this is going to work is basically the bonus is just the normal thing that increases as you level them up. The second line here is the legendary bonus, so non-physical damage multiplier. It's a multiplier there. And then the additional bonus is the if you have enough intelligence within range. Now, the format for this obviously is a little bit screwed up right now. This is probably not 100% in the build that we're getting for the PTR. Some of the Spiritborn stuff isn't really even in there at all. And so, yeah, definitely a work in progress here. But this looks like this is going to be a non-physical glyph here for Canny. It's going to give you like a ton of non-physical damage. So it's like anybody but gorilla style build. And non-physical damage increases all of the non-physical damage the enemy takes up to 10%. So you can get like just a base 10% here. We did see earlier that there is convergence, 20% of your 2 highest bonuses. Having Candy in here pretty much is going to help you hit that number pretty easily. Should give you quite a bit of non-physical damage, which should stack up. Bane. So for every 5 strength purchased within range, you get potion damage, poison damage, not potion damage. So poison damage, and then multiplicative poison damage for the legendary, and then poisoning damage effects have a 15% chance to deal double the amount of damage over the duration. So that is just a 15% multiplier. So this is actually pretty darn good for a poison based build. So if you're looking to like pop off with poison with the Spiritborn, I think Bane is going to be one of those glyphs that you're going to want. Gives you big multipliers, and this is very good. Next up, we have Turf, something similar to what other classes have. Damage to close enemies, multiplicative damage to close enemies, and then damage reduction from close. I think that this is very good, especially if you're looking for DR and damage kind of combined. I don't think Spiritborn has a lot of glyphs that are going to give it defenses. This is a pretty good option in that regard. Ritual is kind of interesting because this plays off of one of the sub powers of Spiritborn, which is Mystic Circles. So Mystic Circles come from aspects that proc off on lucky hit. So example here is the aspect of Soil Power, gives you a lucky hit, 25% chance to create a Mystic Circle, and then casting a Centipede skill on Mystic Circles empowers them to periodically apply poisoning damage for 6 seconds to enemies while extending any crowd control effects affecting them. And so there's a of blank power for every single one of the Spirit Guardians. There's like Plains Power, all of the different things basically. Force Power I think is another one. And they drop this little circle down, and if you have multiple of these things, I'm assuming you're either going to drop multiple circles or the circle itself will just probably get empowered. And this particular one here, Ritual, it will increase the potency of that power. Now some of these I think are going to potentially be busted OP in the beginning, especially because this particular glyph seems to be pretty toned up. So for the legendary power, we're seeing increased damage, and while standing in a Mystic Circle, you deal 10% increased damage and take 10% reduced damage. So I think a lot of people are going to overlook this particular glyph, but I think that this is maybe one of the strongest glyphs that we're going to have, simply because Mystic Circles are actually quite strong if you actually spec into them, which we'll talk about this in a little bit when we get to the aspects. So Colossal pretty much going to give us increased damage with gorilla skills, and a multiplicative damage against close enemies, and then we get increased damage for each stack of resolve we have. So resolve is like a ablative damage reduction thing where you get stacks of it. When you take direct damage, it takes reduced damage from it, but you lose a stack, and you can get quite a few stacks of resolve. I believe there's even aspects that increase the number of stacks you can get. So this could easily go, I believe, like 16, maybe even like 20% damage when you have max resolve. And so as long as you're killing stuff and not getting hit back, your damage is going to stay pretty high. But if you're getting hit a whole bunch, that's a little scary. Next up, we have Revenge. This makes it so that we get bonus to all rare nodes in the range. We get just flat damage. Dealing Thorns damage to an enemy increases all damage it takes from you up to 15%. So once again, if you're playing one of those gorilla builds, one of those centipede builds that are stacking a lot of thorns, this is going to be a no-brainer for you. Next up, Exploit. Very familiar glyph for all the classes, and Spiritborn gets the good version, where when an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds. So just easy peasy vulnerable application for Spiritborn. Spiritborn does have a lot of ways to imply vulnerable, so not necessarily super mandatory, but this is a good stacker of vulnerable damage and just give you multiplicative damage against vulnerable enemies. Next up, Imbiber. I really wish that they would rework this particular glyph for everybody. Originally we thought this was going to be kind of almost mandatory when we thought that damage calculation was different. Now it's just additive damage with some multiplicative damage, I guess, for healthy, but increasing my potion healing doesn't really do anything for me, I think, most of the time, unless you're going to be doing what was it? One of these things. Unless you're going to be like using bitter medicine. So when you heal for 100% of your maximum life, maybe you should do some shenanigans with potions where you're spamming potions to explode. That could potentially be something you want to do, but generally potion healing doesn't really do all that much for you. Next up, we have Consumption. So Consumption is all about Pestilent Swarms. This is a sub power of Centipede, and these can run around and do a whole bunch of damage. And you deal 2% increased damage for each active Pestilent Swarm and Touch of Death Swarm. And I believe you can have quite a few of these up. I believe when we were looking at the Touch of Death Swarms themselves, I believe you can have 3 of these up. So you like kind of slap them on when the enemy dies or the infection runs out over 9 seconds, a swarm pops out of them. And so, that's like 6% damage just from them. Other Pestilent Swarms as well. Also makes your Pestilent Swarm do more damage and more poison damage. This is probably something you're going to see a lot of poison builds run. Next up, we have Hubris, which makes our magic nodes more powerful. We get multiplicative vulnerable damage, and you deal increased Thorns damage equal to 100% of your dodge bonus. So I have a feeling that this might actually get tuned up, because previously dodge was able to go to like 100%, and they've kind of changed how dodge works now, so you can no longer like get to dodge cap, and so dodge kind of gotten weaker, and you know, this could still potentially be rather strong, especially like if you have like 30% dodge or something like that. That's like 30% multiplicative dodge, which is pretty insane. Next up we have Headhunter. No, it's not a belt. This does give you a huge bonus to all normal nodes in range, and then gives you damage and then increased damage to elites. Now, baseline, this might look pretty meh, but I do think that this is potentially super insane glyph, because 30% bonus to all normal nodes at level 1 means that you're probably gonna be hitting like a huge multiplier at like level 100 or something. It's gonna allow you to pick up a ton of dexterity and other stats within the range of this glyph. Since we're limited on glyph, how many boards that we're able to use, it's probably going to take every single freaking node in the range of this glyph, because help you get more stats. Stats are like good for crit, good for, you know, armor, a whole bunch of stuff, and you know, dexterity main skill does give you multiplicative more damage, and so this is going to be a big multiplier in that regard. Spirit makes it so that when you, it's basically something very similar. I think Druid has something just like this. So dexterity turns into critical strike damage. We get multiplicative damage against elites, and then critical strikes increase the damage the enemy takes it from you up to 15%. Like any sort of crit build, this is like a throw in automatically. Crit damage is really good, and then getting critical strikes doing more damage, obviously very good as well. And I think it's just a kind of a no-brainer. Next up we have Fitness. It's going to give us more critical strike damage, and it's going to give us multiplicative critical strike damage, but the additional bonus on this one is kind of a vigor generator. So this one might not necessarily be all that desirable comparatively, whereas this one was giving us 15% more damage. This one's just going to give us a little bit more resources to spend. Now this might potentially solve some of your resource issues at low levels, but typically you've kind of figured it out through other means by the end game. This might be like the only way that you solve your resource issues if you're just critting a whole ton, which could potentially be interesting, but I think 3 vigor seems kind of low. Next up we have Hone. This is all about Jaguar skills, so we're doing increased damage to Jaguar skills, more critical strike damage, and then dealing damage with your Jaguar skills increases your critical strike chance up to 10%. And this is kind of also seems maybe a little bit low, having to like hit 10 times to get 10% critical strike chance. Really just doesn't hold up with actually having a damage multiplier. Because like if we have other glyphs that are giving us 10 or 15% more damage, getting 10% increased crit is not really the same thing at all, which is kind of a little bit unfortunate. Next up we have Fester. This gives us increased damage with centipede skills, more poison damage, and then centipede skills deal increased damage to crowd controlled enemies. I do wish there was something about bosses in here as well. Like I said before, bosses kind of don't get crowd controlled almost at all. It's like they're not crowd controlled at all, and then they become crowd control, and then they take a ton more damage. But it would be nice to be able to like have it spread out a little bit more. Fulminate makes it so that you do increased lightning damage, which is like eagle related stuff. Deal increased damage to distant enemies, and eagles really the only people that are really going to be doing damage at distance. I guess some of the poison stuff can do damage at distance as well. And you get increased lightning damage to both healthy and injured enemies. So as they're like very high health, very low health, you're going to do more damage. Next up we have Menagerist, which makes it so that our incarnate skills get a multiplicative damage, and then it's going to increase our magic nodes. And then dealing damage with your gorilla, jaguar, eagle, or centipede skills increases all damage you deal by 4% for 10 seconds, stacking once per spirit. And this is going to be really interesting with the Harmony hat, because you can potentially get up to 3 or 4 spirits easily into a build. So this could potentially be a 16% damage boost, especially if you're going to do like the 4 different basic skills, combined strikes combinations, maybe even more if you're going to use the Keck staff that we talked about in the other build or the other video. And so yeah, there's quite a bit of different options for you. I do not like, though, the incarnate skill damage here, because there's really only one incarnate skill that does damage, and so this kind of feels like an empty multiplier in that regard, which does feel bad. Next up, we have innate. This is going to give us increased damage with those incarnate skills as well, and then increased damage, and then casting an incarnate skill grants you 15% DR for 7 seconds, which is pretty nice, because there's quite a few good incarnate skills in terms of damage reduction, like counterattack, which gives you dodging, give you DR. The Ironhide, I believe it's called, gives you 100% chance to block. Armored Hide, and then this is also an incarnate skill. Toxic Skin, and then Ravager are the other two as well. And you can even make Razor Wings an incarnate skill. So those are some different options for you for sure. Next up, we have Wildfire. So Wildfire makes it so that you're doing more fire damage, but then also potentially more cold damage. I think that this cold damage is supposed to be fire damage. I don't think that Spiritborn has cold damage. I think that you have poison damage for Centipede, physical damage for Gorilla, lightning damage for Eagle, and then lightning damage, fire damage for Jaguar. And so there's not really any cold damage. So I'm assuming this is supposed to be fire, fire, fire. So increased fire, multiplicative fire, and then damaging enemies with direct fire damage has up to a 30% chance to reduce one of your active cooldowns. So I think that this could potentially be pretty cool. Reducing your cooldowns tends to always be something that's a little bit cheesy in the game, so they agree pretty good. Next, we have Outmatch. So increases the bonus to the rare nodes in range, increase your damage while healthy by multiplicative percent, and you deal increased damage to non-elites and bosses. So this is going to help you out with like non-elites and help you out with bosses. I think this is actually pretty good. Bosses are pretty much the main reason why you're going to like struggle while killing stuff. Elites for the most part can be pretty tanky. We'll have to see how the scaling works with the new progression changes. We have two more. So one is Spirit Feather Potency. Spirit Feathers are something that's like Eagle mechanic where you get them to drop down. There's quite a few aspects that deal with them, and so potentially increasing the potency of them could give quite a bit of damage. Multiplicative lightning damage, and then spawning a Spirit Feather grants you 3% increased damage and 5% increased movement speed, stacking up to 5 times. This will be 15% damage, and there's quite easy to do with some of the aspects we'll talk about here. Next up, we have Talon. Talon gives us increased damage with Eagle skills and lightning damage multiplicatively, and our Eagle skills deal increased critical strength damage. So it's really clear to me that they kind of covered their basis by making sure that kind of each general build has glyphs and legendary powers that kind of cover for it, and it's kind of interesting. Next, let's go look at the aspects. All right, so aspects, there's a whole ton of these here, and there's about 48 of them. I don't necessarily want to go through all of them, but I kind of just want to highlight some of them as we go through. We talked about the of power aspects, which drop down the mystic circles, which we can talk about a little bit. But I do want to talk about duelist's aspect, because duelist aspect seems absolutely bonkers. So ferocity is a thing that you can get with a lot of the Jaguar skills. And if we go here and pop open Spiritborn document here, which I'll link down in the description below. So ferocity increases your attack speed by 5% per stack. It normally stacks only up to 4 times, and each stack lasts for 4 seconds. It's associated with the Jaguar. This brings us up to 9 total stacks of ferocity. And then when we use the hunter, this will overfill your ferocity by 4 stacks. You get to 13 stacks from using the hunter, and this can be pretty ridiculous because that's 13 times 5 attack speed, so you're almost covering your attack speed needs just from this. Counter attack reduces its cooldown by 0.5 seconds per stack of ferocity you have, and I believe in the new datamined version of counter attack is a 20-second cooldown, but still with a lot of cooldown reduction. That's going to help you potentially have a very powerful defensive skill up most of the time, as long as you're keeping your ferocity up. I saw this menacing aspect here that makes it so that Scourge continuously affects enemies around you. for 9 seconds. And Scourge, like, I believe, fears enemies and applies poison to them and slows them. This might be something that, like, would be very interesting for a Z DPS, you know, Spiritborn here, to just be able to, like, continuously apply crowd control to enemies around you. Of course, Soar casts Vortex at this location. I think is really, really cool. Makes it so that, like, when you go to move, all of the enemies that are near where you're going to be going to just get yoinked into one big pile, so you can just blow them up. Also very, very useful for, you know, doing some sort of Z DPS or support thing. Gaining flat block chance here seems pretty good. Blocking an attack from a close enemy has a 70% chance to cast a free concussive stomp. Concussive stomp is a defensive skill that knocks enemies down. It can also give you barrier per enemy hit, and also can do more damage to unstoppable enemies and bosses. And then you can also make it so that when enemies recover from your stomp, you dodge their next 3 attacks, which, you know, seems like a pretty strong combination with you know, automatically shooting it out. This is a utility power, so, you know, you can throw it in a lot of different slots. Aspect of Empowered Feathers makes it so that Eagle skills have a chance to summon a Spirit Feather, like we talked about, and we can collect the Spirit Feathers to reduce your mobility skill cooldowns as well, which is pretty nice. Aspect of Alacrity was one that a lot of people highlighted from the capture event, and looks like they have changed this. It originally used to be your skills have increased cooldown while you're moving, but now it's just defensive skills. Now this is also kind of like interesting verbiage, because this might actually stack with cooldown reduction, because cooldown reduction just reduces the cooldown of the skill when you cast it, whereas this makes it so that they cool down faster. So it's a high potential that these two things maybe will work together in concert to make it so that you can keep some of these defensive skills up pretty frequently. And we just, like, talked about concussive stomp. Counterattack makes it so you can dodge everything. Scourge, you know, we're fearing and poisoning enemies all around us. And then Armored Hide gives us unstoppable and 100% chance to block. So I think there could be some really powerful combinations there. Moving with a mobility skill drops Spirit Feathers along the way. We were talking about before with the Spirit Feathers with I think it was Jagged Plume. Very easy to get these stacked up pretty quickly. Things like Crushing Hand, being able to, the 3rd consecutive cast 10 times around you, dealing more damage, or dealing 45% of his base damage per hit. Definitely potentially to, like, get inside of a boss and hit them 10 times for 450% of its base damage. Yeah, that seems pretty good, especially if you're using the new staff that makes your core skills just basic skills, so you can just spam Crushing Hand all day without having to worry about using resources. Definitely seems pretty good. Talked about the Mystic Circle stuff, so we Aspect of Plains power. This one also works with the Ferocity stuff we talked about, where casting a Jaguar skill in Mystic Circles empowers them to keep you at Ferocity at maximum and increase your damage by 6.5% per stack. So if I have 13 stacks, this is an 84% multiplier. Now you could potentially put this on a 2-hander, but you're probably gonna end up putting on an amulet instead. That could be 126% damage. Now let's say I don't have the overcharged all of the time. Still, that's 9 times 6.5 times 2, 117% multiplier. Maybe a little bit overtuned, but I think this is going to be pretty fun to mess around with. Bristleback aspect. This makes it so that when you dodge or block, you trigger thorns back to them. Simple reprisal. This is one that allows your basic skills to pop off payback. Once again, if you're using the was it Kepelek staff, you can basically turn all of your core skills into basic skills, so you can potentially, I guess, proc payback off of your basic skills as well. Casting a Gorilla skill adds 40% of your armor to all attacks. I could see this being really popular if you're just going to stack armor to the moon, especially with, like, jewelry, gems and stuff. And just adding tons and tons and tons of armor to your attacks could potentially be very powerful. Combined strikes. Each different basic skill you cast increases all your damage by up to 30% for 10 seconds. So you can potentially get 6 different basic skills in your bar with the Kepelek staff. And so that's like 180% multiplier. Maybe even 360%. Actually, no, because you're using Kepelek. So yeah, quite a large multiplier. And then, yeah, there's a lot of very interesting aspects on here as well. One other one to point out is the aspect of redirected force. This one was quite a bit higher in the playtest, 30 to 70% of your block chance, and then blocking doubles this bonus for 10 seconds. So you get up to 140% of your block chance as critical strike damage, which seems very, very powerful. And the sky power here makes it so that casting an eagle skill in mystic circles empowers them to move with you and explode for lightning damage, which kind of implies that you can only have one mystic circle down, maybe of each type at a time. But if you cast an eagle skill in the circle, it moves along with you, which seems pretty cool. Definitely would like to be able to just drag them around and just keep them up 100% of the time. Aspect of haste is basically a speed runner's dream. Every second while moving, gain 30% bonus movement speed for 1.5 seconds, up to 90%. At this speed, you're like almost like moving like at mount speed. I feel like you might not even need to mount up. 90% movement speed, especially like speed running the campaign, is going to be so dumb. Really looking forward to testing this out, because you could potentially even put this on an amulet and get like 135% movement speed. Yeah, which is pretty dumb. Let's see here. After you evade, your next core skill dashes your target and deals increased damage. So you can potentially have a build where you like evade, dash, evade, dash, evade, dash, which is pretty good. I really like aspect of deflection, so while active, counterattack reflects incoming racer wings back out. Other small missiles are also deflected back at enemies and deal 32% of counterattack's base damage on impact. Most small missiles are like what most enemies are sending at you. I think only large missiles are like boss missiles. They did nerf down an aspect of temporal incisions. I did do a video talking about this, because originally you could pretty much just extend your incarnate skills by 2 seconds per hit of rushing claw up to like infinity, and now you can only do it up to 10 seconds, which I still think is rather strong. I think being able to keep 100% block, 100% dodge, tons of extra damage up all of the time just by spamming one button, a little bit overtuned, and this does seem a little bit more fair. We get increased armor and thorns per missing maximum life. If it goes really well with the unique, that gives you tons of DR while you are on low life. Potentially quite a bit of armor, especially with the other aspect that gives you, damage, for your armor. And so combining the two together could be very impactful, especially because Gorilla also gets, thorns damage added. I think those 3 things together is going to be really quite strong. We also have another way to generate resolve here, and then there's at least one more thing. Oh yeah, aspect of forest power. So casting a gorilla skill in mystic circles empowers them to periodically grant you a barrier for 25% of your maximum life, which also increases your armor by another 25%. So definitely seems like there's going to be motivation to stack armor beyond the cap on this particular class, which is pretty cool. And yeah, it's gonna be pretty fun to mess around with and try to figure stuff out. We also have resolve has a 6% chance to not be lost when you're hit for every stack of ferocity you have. Once again, if you have 13 stacks, that's a 78% chance basically just keep your resolve up all of the time. And there is a ring that makes it so that you do gain resolve each time you gain ferocity, so you might not even necessarily need that per se, but yeah. Also, casting a non-basic mobility skill grants 8 resolve and causes your next concussive stomp to strike in a circle around you. So I could see people using this as well, just diving in someplace, pulling all the enemies around you, concussive stomping them. Man, that really does sound like a pretty great Z DPS combo. I'm willing to bet there's going to be a Z DPS Spiritborn. But yeah, that's pretty much all of the stuff here. There's some stuff here that I didn't cover. I'll try to put some of these links down in the description down below. Let me know what you guys think. I'm pretty hyped for Spiritborn. If you're looking forward to some more Diablo 4 content, subscribe because there's more coming. And I hope you guys have a good one. Later.